In 1975, the richest people on Earth did not live in New York. They did not live in Geneva or in the oil sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf. They lived on a coral rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 8 square miles across, that you could walk around in an afternoon. They were so wealthy, they bought sports cars, they had nowhere to drive, they chartered airplanes to fly to dinner. The government paid them simply to exist. And the source of all of it, the thing that made them the richest nation per capita on the face of the planet, was the ground itself. So they dug it up, all of it. This is the long fall of Nauru. To understand what happened to Nauru, you have to understand what Nauru was made of. For thousands of years, seabirds nested on this island by the millions. Generation after generation, they left behind their droppings. The droppings hardened, they mixed with the coral and the marine sediment below, and over geological time, over hundreds of thousands of years, they compressed into one of the purest natural deposits of phosphate rock ever discovered on Earth. The island was quite literally made of fertilizer. Phosphate is not glamorous, but phosphate is the difference between a field that feeds a nation and a field that does not. It is the backbone of modern agriculture, the thing you spread on depleted soil to make crops grow. In the early 20th century, as the industrial world's farmland wore out, phosphate became one of the most strategically valuable substances on the planet. And Nauru, this 8 square mile speck most of the world had never heard of, was sitting on top of some of the finest, highest grade phosphate rock that had ever been found. The people who lived on Nauru, the Nauruans, a Micronesian people with their own language, their own clans, their own 1,000-year history on this island, did not know any of this. They fished, they tended pandanus and coconut. They lived, by every account, well, then in 1900, a prospector named Albert Ellis noticed a strange rock that had been propping open a door in a company office in Sydney. Someone had brought it back from the Pacific as a curiosity. They thought it was petrified wood. Ellis had it tested. It was nearly pure phosphate. And from that single rock, the fate of an entire nation was sealed. What followed was not Nauru's story to tell. For most of the 20th century, the phosphate did not belong to the Nauruans. Germany claimed the island first in the 1882nd. After the First World War, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand took it over and formed a body called the British Phosphate Commissioners, an organization whose entire purpose was to extract Nauru's phosphate and ship it to the farms of the Southern Hemisphere as cheaply as possible. And they did for decades. The rock left by the shipload and the money flowed to Australia and Britain and New Zealand, and the Nauruans were paid almost nothing for the substance that was their island. Then came the war. In 1942, the Japanese occupied Nauru. They built an airstrip across the island, fortified the coast, and when food ran short, deported 1,200 Nauruans to the island of Truk, hundreds of miles away, to work as forced labor. Of those 1,200, only about 700 survived to return home. A third of an entire people gone on a foreign island for a war that had nothing to do with them. When the survivors came back in 1946, they came back to an island that the world's powers still regarded first and foremost as a mine. But something had shifted after the war. The era of empire was ending, and across the Pacific, colonized peoples were beginning to demand their independence and their property. The Nauruans, led by a determined chief named Hammer de Robert, began to push back. They wanted the island, they wanted the phosphate, and above all, they wanted the money. In 1968, after years of negotiation, Nauru became an independent republic, the smallest in the world. And in 1970, the new nation bought out the phosphate operation entirely. For the first time in 70 years, the richest dirt on Earth belonged to the people standing on it. They had no idea how little time they had. What happened next has no real parallel in modern history. A nation of fewer than 10,000 people suddenly owned and operated one of the most profitable mining operations on the planet. In the 1972nd and into the 1982nd, Nauru's phosphate exports generated enormous revenue. By some estimates, on a per-person basis, Nauru briefly had one of the highest national incomes in the entire world, rivaling or exceeding Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the oil states of the Gulf. Divided among 10,000 citizens, the money was almost incomprehensible. And the government did what governments flush with sudden money do. It gave it to the people. Nauruans paid virtually no taxes. Housing was nearly free. Electricity was nearly free. Healthcare and education were free. And the brightest students were flown abroad to Australia at the state's expense. There was no real need to work. And so Increasingly, people didn't. The phosphate was mined by imported laborers from Kiribati, China, and elsewhere, while many Nauruans lived off the dividends of the rock beneath their feet. The stories from this period are the kind that sound invented. The government founded its own airline, Air Nauru, which at its height operated a fleet of jets wildly disproportionate to an island of 10,000 people, aircraft that reportedly sat empty for entire flights or were chartered so an official could fly somewhere for lunch and fly home. Citizens bought sports cars and motorcycles, even though the only road on the island was a single loop you could drive around in 20 minutes. There are accounts of brand new luxury cars abandoned by the roadside when they broke down, simply replaced rather than repaired. Police cars were said to be Lamborghinis. One government official is reported to have bankrolled a West End musical in London about Leonardo da Vinci, which closed almost immediately and lost a fortune. When you have more money than you can possibly spend on an island you can walk across in an hour, the money begins to do strange things. But to get the money, you had to dig. And to dig, you had to destroy the island. Phosphate mining on Nauru was not a discrete operation off in one corner. The phosphate was the interior of the island, the entire central plateau, which the Nauruans called topside. To extract it, the miners stripped away the topsoil, the vegetation, everything living, and then dug the phosphate out from between the ancient coral pinnacles that held it. What they left behind was a forest of jagged limestone spikes, some of them 15 feet tall, with nothing growing between them. Bare, gray, lifeless. Useless for anything. Decade after decade, the mined-out wasteland spread outward from the center of the island. By the 1992nd, roughly 4/5 of Nauru's surface had been strip-mined into this jagged moonscape. The interior of the country was now uninhabitable, too hot, too barren, too broken to live on or farm. The entire population was pushed into a thin green ring around the coast, the only land left that was still alive. They had, quite deliberately and over the course of a century, eaten the inside of their own home. The climate itself turned against them. The bare white rock of the interior absorbed the tropical sun and radiated heat upward, and the rising heat is believed to have disrupted the rain clouds that once formed over the island. Nauru began to suffer droughts. An island in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth started running short of fresh water. The destruction had become a machine that fed itself. The more they mined, the hotter and drier and more broken the island became. There was always a plan, of course, to fix it, to rehabilitate topside, to grind down the pinnacles, bring in soil, replant the interior, and make the island livable again. The plan was studied, it was costed, it was discussed for decades. It would have consumed an enormous share of the phosphate wealth, and so year after year, it was deferred. The money was easier to hand out than to spend repairing the ground it came from, and while they deferred, the phosphate ran out. Here's the thing about a deposit of seabird droppings. However vast, it does not regenerate. There was a finite amount of phosphate under Nauru, and every shipload that left the island was a shipload that would never be replaced. Everyone knew this. It was not a secret or a surprise or an act of God. It was arithmetic. The richest country in the world was a country whose entire wealth was being physically carried away on cargo ships. And one day there would be nothing left to carry. That day arrived in the late 1992 and early 2000s. The high-grade phosphate was essentially gone. But Nauru had seen this coming and it had tried to prepare, recognizing that the rock would run out. The government had set aside a sovereign wealth fund, money invested abroad so that when the phosphate ended, the income would continue. At its peak, this trust fund was reportedly worth well over $1 billion. On paper, Nauru had secured its own future, and then it lost almost all of it. The trust fund was managed catastrophically. The money was poured into a string of disastrous investments, real estate ventures abroad that collapsed, hotels that lost money, properties bought at the top and sold at the bottom. There were accusations of corruption, of mismanagement, of advisors who enriched themselves while the fund bled out. The West End musical was only the most colorful symptom of a much larger disease. Within a few years, a fund that had been worth more than $1 billion was worth a tiny fraction of that. The phosphate was gone. And now the savings were gone too. By the early 2000s, Nauru, which 30 years earlier had been among the richest nations on Earth, was bankrupt. The government could not pay its debts. Air Nauru's last aircraft was repossessed on the tarmac by creditors, leaving the island, for a time, almost completely cut off from the world. Telephones, electricity, basic government services flickered and failed. Unemployment among Nauruans reached staggering levels. The richest people who had ever lived per capita were now standing sick, idle, and broke on the corpse of the island they had consumed. The wealth did not just vanish from the bank, it left a mark on the people themselves. During the boom, the traditional Nauruan diet of fish and local produce was replaced almost entirely by imported processed food, white rice, canned meat, sugar, soft drinks, because it was cheap, easy, and there was no need to fish or farm when you could simply buy. Combined with a sudden sedentary life of plenty, the effect on a population that had been physically active for 1,000 years was devastating. Nauru became, by many measures, one of the most obese nations on Earth, and one of the most diabetic. At various points, a majority of adults were estimated to have type 2 diabetes, among the highest rates ever recorded anywhere. Life expectancy fell. The wealth that had freed the Nauruans from labor had also freed them from the active life that had kept them healthy and replaced their food, their work, and their land all at once. The fortune did not just bankrupt them, it made them sick. It is one thing to lose your money. It is another to spend it strip mining your homeland into a wasteland and feeding yourself into an epidemic. And to do both at the same time with the same hands. And so, with the phosphate gone and the fund destroyed, the bankrupt republic began to do something else to survive. It began to sell the one thing it had left. Itself, its sovereignty. For a fee, Nauru sold passports. It registered offshore banks that became conduits for billions of dollars in laundered money until international pressure shut the practice down. And then, most famously, it agreed to do something for Australia, the same nation that had spent half a century mining its interior away. It agreed to host a detention camp for asylum seekers Australia did not want on its own shores, in exchange for desperately needed cash. The island that had been emptied of its phosphate now rented out what remained of its land and its name to warehouse human beings. The mine had closed. The island had simply found new things to extract. You can tell the story of Nauru as a story about a finite resource. You can tell it as a story about the curse of sudden unearned wealth, about what happens to people when money arrives faster than the wisdom to handle it. You can tell it as a story about colonialism, about a century of foreign powers carving out the island's heart and leaving the consequences for the locals to inherit. You can tell it as a story about a sovereign wealth fund mismanaged into oblivion, a cautionary tale taught in finance classes to this day. All of these stories are true, but the thing that makes Nauru unforgettable is simpler and darker. Most nations that fall are killed by something, by an enemy, by a rival, by a market that moved, by a war. Nauru was killed by Nauru. The phosphate that made it the richest place on Earth was the island itself. And to spend the fortune, the Nauruans had to mine the country out from under their own feet. The wealth and the wasteland were the same thing, viewed at two different moments. There was never a version of this story where they kept both the money and the island. The fortune was the island. And when the fortune was spent, the island was gone. In 1975, the richest people on Earth lived on a green island 8 miles around, and they were rich because of the ground beneath them. By the year 2000, that ground was a poisoned moonscape. The money was gone, the savings were gone, and the people were broken sick on the rim of a place they had hollowed out. The seabirds took hundreds of thousands of years to build that island. It took a single century to carry it away on ships. Thank you for watching The Long Fall. If decline stories like this one interest you, the channel will be here.